Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? My name is Dory Wilson, and I will be moderating this panel on structural racism. I'm joined by, excuse me, Lauren Bastide, who, among other things, is a podcaster for, excuse me, La Poudre in France. Next to her, Reni Eddo-Lodge, writer and journalist for the book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Racism. And Melat Nigussie, writer, podcaster, and also working with Beaux-Arts on the Next Generation Please series here in Brussels. So please welcome them. I want to start with a quote from James Baldwin. Which I think encapsulates the feeling of structural racism. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church that is white and a Christian church which is black. I know that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me, but I know I am not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is against black people, but I know that the real estate lobbyists keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking my life on some idealism which you assure me exists, but which I have never seen. I want to start with you, Reni. Could you just remind the audience of how your book came about, and also bringing about a little bit of discussion around the title and how your findings on the role of structural racism plays in the lives of people of African descent and people of color?
Oh, that's a long question, Doria.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll
break it down. First the book
up.
and then
okay.
Structural racism.
So why the book is a good question. Sometimes people ask me as though I just one day woke up and was like, right, that's it. My tolerance, it's been met. But actually, it was the result. I wrote a blog post about 5 years ago now, titled Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And that blog post was the result of perhaps maybe 4 years of attempting to try, but not just attempting to talk to white people about racism in general, in everyday life, in the coffee shop or colleagues at work or anything like that, or people on the street, because it's actually rather like, it's an odd conversation to bring up with people that you don't know very well. It was not in those circumstances, but rather it was that I was involved in progressive and feminist movements for change, social movements, and I'd been involved in some capacity or another since about 2010, 2011. And I found that particularly in the feminist activist movements, in the places where feminists organized, where we met, attempting to talk about racism in particular, in those circles that were very white dominated, but full of women who claimed that they were for feminism, for social change, against inequality, that attempting to talk about racism was a taboo and it was a line that you were not to cross. And that I found that if you challenge the priorities of the movement, which were very white and middle class, you were told that you were being divisive. And if you tried to raise that perhaps black women and women of color dealt with issues not just to do with sexism, but to do with racism and to do with class discrimination, then you were told this isn't really the movement for you. There's a chapter in the book where I detail, in particular, the incidences that happened in my life and in the activist environments that I was in that led to me, just 1 month after that, those circumstances, writing the blog post, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. I found myself repeatedly demonized and told that I was divisive and that I was the problem for trying to discuss how racism affected not just me, but also like when I tried to describe how racism was working in society, the white women in particular around me perceived that as an attack on them. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. I have to set a boundary because I'm tired of being told that I'm the problem when I point out the problem. The book came about because I was a freelance journalist, you know, not very successful freelance journalist, just doing little bits here and there, you know, when newspapers or magazines who claimed to be for diversity decided that they would hire somebody on a freelance basis and pay them a small amount of money rather than change their editorial direction or actually hire any black people. So that was basically the basis of my job. And I was very fatigued by that as well. I was tired of white progressives in particular. But when I wrote that blog post, it went viral, is the term that we use. You know, it spread around the internet like wildfire. People all around the world reached out to me. You're nodding. Did you read it at the time? Oh, there you go. People around the world reached out to me saying, thank you for saying this. I've been trying to say this for a very long time. People of color in particular. And white people reached out saying, gosh, this has absolutely fundamentally changed my mind on something. And because that blog post, you know, went viral, I got a little bit more work, still not enough to live on. But within a year, I had signed a deal to write a book. But when the agent reached out to me, he said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And he didn't know about the blog post, which I thought was funny. But I responded that, you know, I couldn't write about anything else. It had to be about structural racism. It had to be about the one issue that I'd been trying to get progressives to care about, let alone the rest of the world. That's your answer to question number one, Dory.
That's lovely. Yeah, so I mean, to Lauren and to Melat, could you talk a bit about how the book and the conversation around structural racism that Reni puts forward sort of impacted the way you look at structural racism? And I find it really interesting, and you make a point of it in the book, of saying distinctly you're saying structural racism and not institutionalized racism. So that's I'd like you and then Lauren to give me some feedback on that.
Yeah, so I read the blog post you wrote, and I recognized a lot of things in it because in 2017, I actually wrote an article for Knek magazine, Belgians in the audience might know it, called The Horror of White Progressives. And it was my experience in progressive circles and how I would constantly and consistently hit a wall every time I mentioned intersectionality and you know, racism. Just even talking about racism was always kind of uneasy, uncomfortable. So I then tied it into the movie Get Out, that just was released that year, and how, you know, you saw these progressives in the movie. You had an interracial couple, and the way racism is very prevalent and prevailing, you know, amongst those communities as well. So I recognize a lot of the things that you said, especially, you know, in feminist circles. In Belgium, I think the conversation is still even less evolved, unfortunately. I recently had an incident where I was part of the board of a feminist organization, very white feminist organization. I'm not going to say the name here. And I was the only black woman in the board, and I had the sense that I was being tokenized, that, you know, I was just there for pure decor and not like really, I didn't really have a voice, or I didn't really have anything to say. So when I mentioned that they reacted very hostile. They didn't understand it because they were feminists after all, and they were, combating and battling against white patriarchy, or just patriarchy in their case. So they didn't really know what I was talking about. They were very defensive, and that reaction you just get over and over and over again until the point where you're like, okay, what can you do if progressives don't want to embrace the dialogue around race? You just get tired and kind of like powerless. So you find other ways to sort of fight power. And in my case, it's putting time and energy in my community and educating people of color and black people in Belgium, and not really engaging with white people on racism in the sort of way where they always make you engage with racism, sort of like convince them that it's a problem and convince them that people deal with it on a daily basis. So I 100% can relate to your book, and I think activists all over Europe can relate to your book and the issues that you talk about.
Thank you.
Lauren?
I remember I discovered Reni's book on a trip to London. I did it, I think, 2 years ago almost. I remember seeing the cover of the book. It's really. Do you mind showing it? Because it's really amazing the way it's done. Like why I'm no longer talking to white people, which is written white on white, which is like really about invisibility also of the questions you talk about in the book. So I was just distracted by the aesthetics of the book and the title, of course. And when I read it, it was a slam in my face, especially the chapter you mentioned, Reni, about feminism and about how these racial issues are not raised in most of the white feminist circles. And what I tried to do with La Poudre, the podcast I created and launched in France a little more than 2 years ago, was bringing intersectionality in the approach of feminism in the most. I tried to make it a bit mainstream. I tried to bring it to a larger audience than the activists and the students and the sociologists. I really wanted it to reach a big audience. Maybe one thing you need to know is I worked for Elle magazine for 10 years, so I have this. I'm a journalist for the pop culture, let's say, and at Elle, one of the reasons why I left this magazine is it took me a while, but one day I just counted how many black women were on the cover of the magazine, and I realized it was one a year, maybe in the best case, and it's going to be Beyoncé. And I thought we have an issue here because Elle, which basically means she, and all these cover of magazines that are everywhere in the city, what does it mean for little black girls to see that she is always this white, heterosexual, blonde, skinny, 30-year-old woman, and where are all the other women? So with La Poudre, I tried to make the voices of the other women heard, and I hate this other because other means it's part of the structural racism to think that this person that is not this white woman is another person. And anyways, when I discovered Reni's book, I had the feeling I had found a version of bell hooks of Audre Lorde, but I could interviewed. Reading bell hooks or Angela Davis really helped me understand how I could change my approach to feminism and maybe help French people to change their approach to feminism. And so, when I found the book and realized Reni was right away, 1 hour away in Eurostar. And I could talk with her and bring her incredibly witty and fun, yet very serious and very convincing words to France. I just wanted to do it. And thank you for the interview, Reni. It was amazing.
You.
Thanks.
And the second part of your question, why structural and not institutional, I think you explain it very well in your book, because institutional would only limit it to institutions like, education or the NHS, but you really talk about structural racism as a sort of way of thinking, evasive. It's in the entire society, and that's what I liked about your definition of really dissecting it and making the difference between institutional and structural, which is more profound and a bit everywhere and not just limited to the institutions.
Thank you. I think that, institutional is useful when we think about the organizations that we all have to interact with in order to get by in this world. Education, employment, healthcare, housing. These are all institutions that we need to interact with in some way because we all need a job, we all need to get an education. And there's tons of evidence in the UK in particular to show that there's real racial bias in those institutions. Significant, and I go into some detail about it in the book. But also I think it's important to remember that those institutions they're not abstract, they're made up of people who, when they leave work, go off into the rest of society holding that bias. Structural racism is the collective, essentially, result of bias, whether it be quiet or overt. And I think that I use structural because I think that it's important to remember that our families are structures, our friendship groups are structures, our relationships can be structures. And this isn't just about the bias in these massive institutions that we expect to treat us fairly but fail, but it's also the hostility that you can find attempting to try and talk to a white friend about a racist incident that you came across, and the white friend says, no, that wasn't racism. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Why are you making a big deal? And you really thought this person understands you, and then suddenly they're telling you to make themselves feel better that what you just experienced didn't exist and it's all in your head. And I think that's just as valid. That denial of the literal way that you're having to move through the world is just as valid as getting a lower grade on a test than your white counterpart, or not getting the job even though you were perfectly qualified and somebody with the same qualifications and experience but who happens to be white gets the job too.
Yeah. No, excellent. Recently there's been a lot of activity in Belgium in regards to people of African descent. The UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, as part of the UN Decade for People of African Descent, kind of did a fact-finding mission in Belgium from the 4th to the 11th of February and went to 5 cities within Belgium, assessing the human rights situation of people of African descent living in Belgium and gathering information on the forms of discrimination and related intolerance they face. On the 26th of March, which was just last week, the European Parliament passed an inaugural resolution on the fundamental rights of people of African descent, specifically in Europe. Do you think that these actions have an impact on the dismantling of structural racism, or is this just political window dressing? Ain't nothing to it but to do it, y'all.
Well, since I'm the Belgian here. So that's a very big question. I think, I have to be cynical here. I think the UN, as far as institutions go, isn't the most reliable when it comes to people of African descent or Africa, the continent. So I do think there's a bit of political window dressing going on here. I mean, they filed a report, but there's been numerous studies and reports on Belgium and the situation for people of African descent. I gladly refer you to the report of the Roi Baudouin, Koning Boudewijn Stichting, that showed clearly last year, showed clearly that people of Congolese, Burundese, and Rwandese descent are the most educated group in Belgium, more than Belgians themselves and more than any other migrant group, but they face 4 times more discrimination on the job market, and 80% of them said that they have been discriminated in their lives. I mean, we see studies and reports like that every day, every week, every month, and I haven't seen any structural change, so I don't really have any high hopes for this one either.
And if I might sort of add on to that, I think that you cannot underestimate how deeply frustrating and disappointing it is, to hear a stat like that. And, I hear similar things in the UK, and there's a stat that I quote that from the Trades Union Congress in the book that shows that, wealth inequality between black people in particular and their white counterparts in Britain widens the more educated that black people are. It's frustrating to see talented people consistently and underemployed, like consistently. You know, we all swallow up this lie of meritocracy as children. We're all told that, you know, if you just work hard enough, you'll get to where you want to be in life. Yet we have literal evidence to show us that meritocracy doesn't exist and that you cannot educate yourself out of racism. And it's a very dangerous thing for society when some of the most educated people are being systematically discriminated against. And I think that that's something that, you know, inequality is very bad for all of us. Very bad for all of us is what I'd say.
Lauren, you want to add something to that?
Well, I think it's interesting to have this question formulated from a European point of view, because like I'm glad there has been at some point some consensus about a text, even if it's only a bit of a, you know, powder. But I think that the situation between the different countries of Europe are unfortunately very, very different. And for example, the word race in France is a huge taboo.
Yeah, besides the fact that it was erased from the Constitution last year.
Exactly. And it's funny because race was erased and gender was added, which is like really interesting. You're like, okay, so we're all the same, but not really, but there are some differences. You can name some other that don't exist. We're like totally colorblind, and that's really an issue. And I think even the title of the panel today, even the way this conversation is being led and the words we use would not be acceptable in an institutional event in France. I mean, this conversation is not allowed to happen in France. So if some little help from Europe might bring this subject even for 2 minutes in the French Parliament, I say thank you.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, this is a 5-year project. It took the entirety of the mandate between 2014 and 2019 to get to the 26th of March to have this inaugural resolution passed. And so, and it was, you know, and this is why, I mean, Brexit becomes a real issue in terms of progress. It was led by a British MEP and Cecile Kyenge, who's the head of the Anti-Racism Diversity Intergroup for the European Parliament, and as you well know, the only black member of European Parliament. So that's what it took to get that, and the mandate now, or the pressure now, is to try and get, which is always, it's exactly what you say, is to get member states to actually do national action plans to implement the resolution. So, you know.
If I could also add,
Yeah.
I want to sort of tag on a little bit to what I was saying about, you know, underemployment of educated people is dangerous. But the flip side of that is that if you have some of the most educated members of your society consistently underemployed because of discrimination, it stands to reason, because jobs are essentially a zero-sum game, that you staff your organizations with people who are mediocre.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
exactly.
that is the flip side of it, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by it doesn't really work out for any of us in society.
No.
When it comes to, you know, this UN report that you speak of, I think that these things they can be political window dressing if those of us who are invested in anti-racism, who are not part of the organization doing that work, don't hold them to account on it, essentially. And that's why, you know, in Britain, you know, all of my time when I was a freelance journalist trying to do meaningful work around anti-racism and not really getting anywhere, I would see year after year reports come out from different sectors, never anything as like all-encompassing as the UN, but sectors here, theatre, journalism, the arts, science, technology, business, repeatedly, that showed that there was extreme like racial discrimination, and like there would be a news report about it, usually in the Guardian, the left-leaning paper, and everyone would like share it and be like, oh, this is really bad, and then people just go on with their day.
Yeah, exactly.
And I sort of felt like, as a journalist, and I still feel this as an author, that there has to be popular energy around around these things. And what I wanted to do with the book was take all of these like disparate reports that had come out over the past decade and knit them together to really show the overwhelming like level of structural barriers
and evidence.
And how that impacts people of color more broadly, but black people's lives specifically in Britain. You know, it sounds not so bad if you hear just one stat about education, but then when you knit it together and you see that in education, employment, housing, healthcare, oh, there's bias there, there's bias there, there's bias there, in all of these institutions that you have to interact with over the course of your life. Like, how can we continue to believe in meritocracy when we have that evidence? And what I hope that I did with the book was to make it real for people rather than just abstract, I suppose.
Yeah, and to carry on, I mean, to go into this sort of false narrative of meritocracy, it's usually put as a counterpoint to arguments talking towards the integral nature of structural racism in regard to all aspects of life. And given the recent college admissions scandal, can the narrative of meritocracy continue to be used as a valid description of the mechanisms defining access with regard to people of African descent and people of color? So, Lauren, you talked about this whole idea of, and which is true in the European institutions, the trade to not talk about race is to do gender balance. And when people, you know, get terrified about positive discrimination, which they say in the UK, versus affirmative action, the point has to be made that affirmative action was only for government institutions. It was not for the private sector. The second aspect is the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women, which falls back into the whole frame of gender balance. So can we talk a little bit about this, what you guys think about this whole idea of meritocracy and how it plays in the geographies that you're working in, but also just your, you know, I mean, it feels like gaslighting, basically. So can we just, you know, have a discussion a little bit more on this meritocracy? Because I think that that is, particularly in America, which then gets fed over, is that, you know, this is this whole American dream narrative, but the dream is only applicable to a certain segment of the population, and everybody else is sort of left out of the equation.
Well, you know, in the UK, we haven't had our own college admission scandal yet. But, I mean, you just need to look at Boris Johnson to know that some of the most mediocre float to the top.
No, exactly.
But
like
we have
turd.
stats like that show that 77% of the population go to private school, and by private school, if you're not familiar, it's fee-paying schools rather than state schools. Yet privately educated people make up the majority of parliament. They make up the majority of the judiciary. They make up half of all journalists. How is that meritocratic? Yet we're still convincing ourselves that if you just work hard, then you'll get there. I find myself, as somebody from a working class background, now making a good living as an author, as a journalist, surrounded by the children of the rich. You know, I do. And they're very nice people, but I can't help but think, like, I lived for 7 years in poverty in order to be able to do this work, and you're here because of you went to private school or because of who your parents are. Like, it doesn't seem fair to me. Not saying you're not talented, just it does not seem fair to me.
I think in Belgium, when it comes to college, you know, there's no like real monetary, like financial barriers, but there are other barriers, and they already start in high school, where you have this educational caste system of ASO, TESO, BESO. So ASO are those that, you know, are trained to go to college, and then TESO are sort of applied academic learning, so you can either go to college or start work, and then BESO is vocational training. You go straight to the job market. You can go to college if you want to, but it's going to be significantly harder because you don't have the academic or theoretical background. So what you see when you see at this caste system is that all children of color, or like black children, are mostly to be found in TESO or BESO, and are rarely found in ASO. Like, I was educated in ASO. I was the only black girl in my classroom, one of the very few black girls in my Catholic high school. And this is structural. This is consistently all over Belgium. They recently reformed high school in a very weird way. No one can really understand it. They wanted to get rid of this caste system, but then they didn't get rid of it. It's weird. I mean, I still have to talk to one person that can explain it to me, what they, you know, the change they implemented. So from an early age on, children of color here in Belgium are told, ASO, I don't think you can handle it. I don't think you're smart enough or academic enough. Why don't you try TESO or BESO? And that's a real big problem, because these children are talented. They're equally as smart as their white, you know, counterparts, but yet they're not to be found in the academic ASO, direction. So, and one of the other things is like how language is perceived growing up in a multilingual home, etc. Children that grow up in multilingual homes are often seen as less intelligent, less capable, because when they do like a language tests, they test them on their knowledge of Dutch or French, but they don't take into account the language of the words that they know in Arabic or Turkish, or, you know, in my case, Amharic. They just don't, you know, consider that to be valuable or to be important. So you see this constantly systemic way of putting children of color in Belgium in lower school directions and lower skilled jobs. And, you know, that doesn't go with the meritocracy of like, if you work hard enough, you'll get there, because we're not even given the opportunity to show what we can and what we're capable of in this country.
There is so much I would love to say around what you just said, girl. But Reni, you used the sentence, we have stats. We have stats. Well, the thing is, in France, we don't have stats.
They have them, they just don't give them.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Well,
they have them because they can find everybody.
They could, of course, they could.
So,
and the associations and the activists and the benevolence find it and create it and waste their time like making this big investigation to get those figures, but there is no official version of those figures because race doesn't exist in France.
It's the same way in Belgium.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are probably some really, I don't know, good reasons historically, maybe some traumas that explain this structure of thing in France. I don't know, but it makes people really blind about this structural racism, and I think it's really about this universal, this norm being this white male heterosexual thing. If you don't count, if you don't get the figures, you don't see it. You can walk through life, walk through the city forever without noticing all the people that are just missing in the public space, and that's a big issue. And also, I was very interested what you say about language. I remember in Paris 8, it's a great university I attended in Paris. One day there was a Parole non blanche, so it was a group talk for people of color. People that were not affected could attend, but just listen, which was really very, very interesting. And I remember this mom, I think she was from Morocco, and she was raising her kids in Arab and French. And after school, the teacher came to her, and because she was talking to her kid in Arab, and she said, I don't think it's a good thing you talk to your kid in Arab right now. And she said, had I been Swedish or American and speaking to my kid in Swedish or in English, I would have been like, oh my God, that's great. It's going to be bilingual. And that really was a shock and a revelation to me, like as these things that are invisible but that are in everyday life of every woman of color in France today. And yeah, the amount of racism at every single step of the school and the student path for people of color in France is a nightmare.
Yeah, and I think one of the things which I'm going to carry on with you, Lauren, on this is one of the key aspects in Belgium, but also in France, is this notion of communitarianism, which is a big block and which is rarely discussed. But it is the epitome of structural racism because it only refers to black people. Communitarianism, Reni, is like basically if there is an aggregation of black people who decide that they, for example, want to create a not-for-profit or they want to create an art space or whatever, black people making that leap are perceived as practicing communitarianism, which then disallows them from getting any public money for their activities.
I see. But white people with all white organizations get
Right.
funding with no problems.
Right.
I'm assuming.
Right. Yeah. So it's really.
They won't say that it's all white. They won't say it's all white, but you just have to see that
Yeah.
it's all white. Yeah.
And so this becomes a real barrier in terms of maintenance and the sustainability of organizations that are independent, that are focused on the issues facing people of African descent. And I don't know, Lauren, I mean, do you want to, sort of chime in about the impact of this in the French context? And maybe Melat, I mean, you can... Yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to, because it's something that really is a kind of unspoken, like accepted, like we cannot discuss communitarianism, but it's very, very real.
I think it's in French. In France, it's also a very scary word. Like people are very freaked out by this idea of community,
Yeah.
and people who face the same discrimination, like gathering together to speak about it. Wow, how scary! I have this example.
Because I know that people it's going to start planning how
Yeah.
to challenge it.
Yeah, and you might even have ideas,
Yeah.
and defend themselves. Woo. So yeah, there is this example of what happened in Paris a couple years ago. There is this Afro-feminist association called Nigussie, who really do an incredible job. Educating and empowering black women in France. And so they organized this festival, and inside the festival there were a few groups of talking that were reserved for black women. And suddenly the right, very far right conservative people on Twitter basically starting pointing this event as an event that was forbidden to white people, which is not the same thing as reserved for black women. It really doesn't mean the same, and it's really not the same thing to say that. And the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, who is a left-wing woman who defends some ideas I really support, like, for example, on environmental issues. She's great. But she forbid these talks. It's not possible because it's not possible to make a group gather according to their race. Oh my God, I want to be able to go into this group. And I interviewed her on my podcast, and I hoped she might have, I don't know, read a book or something and maybe understood it was really okay for black women to gather and share their experience. But no, she didn't change her mind. And she said, I don't like this because that makes me feel that I am perceived as racist. And that's really interesting. That's really white fragility. Don't tell me that I'm racist. It's horrible discrimination against me. And then that's what Reni says. I love the way you say it. It's not about you.
But it is if she keeps going on like that.
Yeah. Melat?
Because I think once you've been made aware of the issues, you have a decision whether or not you choose to challenge them or you choose to defend them. And I think it's very interesting, the path that she takes. I want to... Actually, no, you were going to talk, so...
Go ahead.
Okay. I want to pick up on something you said a bit earlier, Lauren, about the trauma around the word race, because I've noticed this as like, you know, my book is taken to different sort of countries around the European continent in particular. And I think that because I seek to understand ideas that I largely disagree with, I can understand the trauma. I think, you know, it's not a coincidence that when my book was published in German and when it was published in French, the word race was omitted from the title of each. And the more reading and thinking that I do about not just anti-racism, but the origins of the concept of race in the first place, you know, the clearer it is to me that, you know, the concept of race is a racist construct. Not only that, but like the key thinkers in Europe who really proliferated the concept of race as a sociological tool to deem others some inferior for the benefit of others were French and German. So it's not surprising to me, actually, that like publishers in each country would be like, let's omit this word, you know. Let's not splash it over book covers that will be available publicly, because that's a real like harking back to the word race. What is it in French? In German, it's Rasse.
Race.
Yeah, like directly reminds people of the Nazis who pushed the concept to disgusting and devastating consequences. And the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, you know, in his book Between the World and Me, he writes, you know, race is the son of racism, not the father. And I, as a racist, as an anti-racist, can you believe that? The trolls have got to me, guys. I've been hounded by the far right on Twitter every day since they said I was a racist. I was like, you know what, maybe I am. As an anti-racist, it makes perfect sense to me that the concept of race, like, is a racist concept. In fact, I just read a great book. It's not out yet. It's called Superior, and it's about the origins of race science and how science was used over the years to essentially try and find biological differences between people of different skin colors to prove that some are inferior, and always to position white people as superior. So largely, like, we are all the same. Like, all of us on this panel share 99.99999% of DNA biologically. But that doesn't mean that our social experiences of how we like move through this world are the same. And despite the fact that like modern day science has fundamentally debunked the idea of any sort of biological race, and that's been done roundly and fundamentally, I think that's something that we can all agree. It doesn't mean that like socially, like we're all the same. Like the legacy of the society that essentially produced racist science to say that people of African descent were inferior in order to justify their oppression. Like, we're still mentally living like under that kind of like essentially categorization. And so when we talk about people gathering to discuss that discrimination, we're talking about how we are living under racism still, you know, and it's not contradictory, I think, to acknowledge the two. The issue sometimes is that I think that like white progressives say, oh, well, we're all the same. And it's like, okay, yes, biologically, yes, but socially, you know, in the UK, if you have an African or Asian sounding name and you apply for a job, your CV's less likely to get looked at than somebody with a white British sounding name, despite the fact that you have similar qualifications and experience. And so socially, like, we are not being perceived as the same. Socially, we are dealing with discrimination, despite the fact that, like, biologically, like, race has been thoroughly debunked. I just wanted to add that in case somebody wants to raise it at the Q&A. Like, I've ironed that kink out.
I just wanted to say something about the Belgian situation. I remember in 2014, I founded Belgian Renaissance. I don't know if you
Yeah,
remember it.
absolutely.
So me and two other friends, we wanted to organize events in Brussels mostly, catering to African diaspora youth. And we created all these events talking about Black issues for Black people. And I remember the conversations we had with white people who were like, why do you need this organization, and
That's
why
always
is
the
it
first
only
question.
for Black people, and are we allowed to come, and what does this mean?
What would they find there? What would they discuss?
Exactly. Exactly. So we found ourselves in the position of having to explain ourselves constantly. I think your phone is ringing.
No, it's the timer.
Oh.
Yeah, just carry on. Just carry on.
So we had to explain, like, we felt uneasy or uncomfortable talking about these issues with white people because we didn't feel safe. And, you know, all this talk about safe spaces, I know the word has been overused, but it is important to create a safe space to talk about issues that are very personal, very intimate, and not to find yourself having to defend yourself constantly, because I guarantee you, if there's a white person there, you'll have to defend yourself, because it's very rare to find a white person that's, you know, listening and that's not talking. Usually when you have events, for instance, the first question is always asked by a white guy, always, consistently. So I'm really curious to see what's going to happen at the Q&A. But so we had to defend ourselves from that. We had to create our own spaces, talk about our issues to our community, our people. And it was really interesting to see how white people thought that was threatening, and they had no self-reflection or introspection from their side, because they would go to their white heroes groups and scouts groups, and those are all white groups, but no one questioned those. So, you know, white organizations, I wish they had the same critical reflection on their own organization as they had for Black spaces or people of color spaces. So, yeah.
No, very good point. I mean, and also, I mean, I think that there is, you know, the underlying feature of everything that's just been said around that is the fact that it's awkward for them because it's normative.
Of course, it threatens the status quo.
Exactly. So if you say, you know, you basically, I mean, no disrespect, but, you know, white people kind of have an all-access pass to most spaces. So if people of color say, you can't come in, it's like, but what do you mean? I mean, I can go everywhere I want to go. I mean, what has changed in the world between now and you starting this that says now that I am restricted?
Even if you know that it's not that relevant, you're like, well.
Yeah. But yeah.
I'm not trying to go to the motorbike conference. I don't care. But I don't have this level of entitlement in me. It's like, but I want to go.
Outrage.
Just on principle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the funny thing is, if they are not allowed to go, they're going to want to go. But if you organize a feminist conference and you don't say it's only for women, there are not going to be any men. So don't worry, you don't even have to.
People react less hostile when you say this is a safe space for women versus this is a safe space for people of color or Black people. Then they get upset, and then they get defensive. Yeah. So it's interesting how gender has become a safe topic, and you know, race is still very, very controversial.
And I think that, like, all of these comments like feed in often to the reaction of the book. Like the response that people have to the book, because it quite clearly, the cover and the title quite clearly decenters whiteness. It's very clear that there's no white author behind it, which is very rare in a bookshop, guys. I remember right in the early days when the cover was like doing the rounds on the internet, people were very taken by it. It's a great piece of graphic design. The cover design actually won a prestigious design award for it. I remember there was this thread on Reddit where somebody had like posted a cover of the picture of the cover of the book, and they were like, so should I read this then because I'm white and it's quite clear that the author doesn't want to speak to me? And and I was like, it's incredible how, I mean, a friend sent it to me. This was before I said to them, don't send me any information about what people are saying about my book on the internet. Like, I'm trying to live a peaceful life.
Exactly.
Like, it's out now. What can I do? There was this like debate on Reddit. So I read the whole thread, and it was really interesting because people were trying to explain to this person. They were like, "You're suspending logic a bit. Like, how often do you get to speak to the author of a book that you read?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Not very often.
Exactly.
So why do you think that it's different in this regard? And if you're so distressed about the fact that like the author might not want to speak to you, then you don't have to read it."
Yeah.
But the entitlement and the puffed up like entitlement just kept going. And I thought it was very interesting because I think that like every time somebody has a hostile response to the book, and if they ask me about it, I say, well, the first word is why. So it does suggest an explanation. If you're interested in the explanation, you can always read it.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're not, you can just keep it moving. I'm just going to keep living my life. It's not up to me. I'm not at the till, saying, no, you can't buy it. Like, no, yes, you can. Like, I think it's very strange.
Yeah, exactly. Well, soul children, we got 5 minutes. So
questions high quality and
yeah,
concise.
you know, maybe 2 questions. Okay. I have one here,
quality.
and I have
You
one
can
in the
write that
back.
down.
I'll give you my mic, and you can. I'm not sure what my tech.
Thanks. Thank you so much. What a great panel. I wanted to ask, because this is something that I get exhausted by a lot, is whenever you talk about race, the retort is always, yeah, but there's racism against white people too. Racism means racism against all races. And that gets really exhausting. So I know you talk about structural racism and that talks about it and that answers it, but just that term really kills me.
Okay, my answer, tell them to read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And then, then ask them to come back and have a chat. Melat?
I think that question just shows how juvenile the discourse around race is in this country and all over the world. I just find myself talking to people that don't have
good point.
any language around race, any knowledge about race, and I really, blame education for that first and foremost. I think, you just have to break it down to them, give the definitions. What is racism? It's, everyone has prejudices, everyone has biases, but you need that one key element to be racist, and that's power. And black people in this country, or in a lot of other countries, don't have the scale or the tools to organize themselves to structurally discriminate against people. So I still have to find a country where white people are structurally discriminated against. Even in Africa, they're the ones, South Africa, Zimbabwe, they're the ones in power that have all the wealth. So, it's just a lack of understanding of the language around race and what racism is and the history, and I just find it a very tiring conversation.
I personally would not have that conversation.
No, indeed.
Yeah. Exactly.
Because, the original blog post that I wrote, sometimes people try to trip me up and they say, haha, but here you are talking to a white person, and I say, I've been doing promo for this book for 2 years. Like, do you think that I'm not going to speak to... Anyway, listen. What I say is, when people try to challenge me on that, I say, well, if you read the second line of the blog post, it says, not all white people, just the vast majority who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms. I remember it off by heart. So in that case, that's a white person who refuses to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms, and so I would pass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed.
I think there is also an issue of racism often being perceived as a moral or like a personal individual issue. Mm-hmm. I think people often feel really personally attacked when you tell them that what they have just said or done is racist. Like, that means I'm I'm mean.
Yeah.
It's
good,
not
bad
about
binary.
you being mean. It's about society and history and culture. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons why this term is often misused also, I guess.
Yeah. One more. That's it. One more. Oh, beautiful people. Now, I got 4 hands and I got 1 question. There it is. Let's go here in the middle, in the back.
Can we get a microphone to them?
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Can you do like this? Because I don't see you. Okay.
Yeah. What's your question?
Yeah, that's exactly what you raised.
I answered that.
Yeah, we already answered that
Yeah,
question.
I answered that in terms of like, yes, all of us in this audience and this panel share 99.99999% of biology. Like, there's no biological difference between. There is really the human race, you know, like. But we don't all share the same like social experience. We don't all face the same types of discrimination, and so that's what I'd say to your friends, I suppose, if they did ask me that. But I would avoid that conversation in the first place.
Indeed. I just make one last point, and then I would ask that you meet us in the foyer for signing with Reni. And I just want to thank you all for coming on Sunday afternoon to spend this time with us. It's been really joyful. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. It's a heavy topic for a Sunday
you.
afternoon.
Okay. I just will make one point. So this is a discussion, this has been a discussion of structural racism, but what it's really about is access and a place at the table. Communities of African descent have been the sources of wealth creation in the West via the vagaries of slavery and colonialism, and we should be honest about this. The lifestyle enjoyed by the West is built on the backs of millions of people of African descent and people of color across the globe. It's now time to write a new chapter which incorporates the history and contributions of people of color within these national narratives. We are not interlopers. We have been here from the beginning, and we will remain until the bitter end. Woo!